gekozen om een stuk voor te lezen uit Miss Dalloway. Waarschijnlijk wel de meest bekende roman van Virginia Woolf. Ik heb hier een stuk gekozen dat misschien een beetje minder bekend is. Een fragment waar eigenlijk een van de nevenkarakters een stem krijgt, Peter, een vriend van Miss Dalloway. En het is heel interessant om te zien hoe Virginia Woolf op dat moment eigenlijk zoveel zegt, op een heel klein stuk tekst. Heel veel zegt over het leven, over de aard van de mens, over toekomst en verleden. Heel veel mooie analogieën gebruikt. Het is gewoon een heel ontroerend stuk, vind ik zelf. And it was awfully strange, he thought. How she still had the power, as she came tinkling, rustling, still had the power, as she came across the room, to make the moon, which she detested, rise at Burton at the terrace in the summer sky. Tell me, he said, seizing her by the shoulders, are you happy, Clarissa? Does Richard... The door opened. Here is my Elizabeth, said Clarissa, emotionally, histrionically perhaps. How do you do? Said Elizabeth, coming forward. The sound of Big Ben striking the half-hour struck out between them with extraordinary vigor, as if a young man, strong, indifferent, inconsiderate, were swinging dumbbells this way and that. Hello, Elizabeth, cried Peter, stuffing his handkerchief into his pocket, going quickly to her, saying goodbye, Clarissa, without looking at her, leaving the room quickly, and running downstairs and opening the hall door. Peter, Peter, cried Clarissa, following him out on the landing. My party tonight, remember my party tonight, she cried, having to raise her voice against the roar of the open air, and overwhelmed by the traffic and the sound of all the clocks striking, her voice crying, Remember my party tonight, sounded frail and thin and very far away as Peter Walsh shut the door. Remember my party, said Peter Walsh as he stepped down the street, speaking to himself rhythmically, in time with the flow of the sound, direct downright sound of Big Ben striking the half-hour. The leaden circles dissolved in the air. Oh, these parties, he thought, Clarissa's parties. Why does she give these parties, he thought. Not that he blamed her, or this effigy of a man in a tailcoat with a carnation in his buttonhole coming towards him. Only one person in the world could be as he was, in love. And there he was, this fortunate man, himself, reflected in the plate glass window of a motor car manufacturer in Victoria Street. All India lay behind him. Plains, mountains, epidemics of cholera, a district twice as big as Ireland, decisions he had come to alone, he, Peter Walsh, who was now really, for the first time in his life, in love. Clarissa had grown hard, he thought, and a trifle sentimental into the bargain, he suspected, looking at the great motor cars capable of doing how many miles on how many gallons? For he had a turn for mechanics, had invented a plough in his district, had ordered wheelbarrows from England, but the coolies wouldn't use them, all of which Clarissa knew nothing whatever about. The way she said, Here is my Elizabeth, that annoyed him. Why not, Here's Elizabeth, simply? It was insincere, and Elizabeth didn't like it either. Still the last tremors of the great booming voice shook the air around him. The half-hour, still early, only 11:30 still. For he understood young people, he liked them. There was always something cold in Clarissa, he thought. She had always, even as a girl, a sort of timidity, which in middle age becomes conventionality. And then it's all up, he thought, looking rather drearily into the glassy depths, and wondering whether by calling at that hour he had annoyed her. Overcome with shame suddenly at having been a fool, wept, been emotional, told her everything, as usual. As a cloud crosses the sun, silence falls on London, and falls on the mind. Effort ceases. Time flaps on the mast. There we stop, there we stand, rigid. The skeleton of habit alone upholds the human frame. Where there is nothing, Peter Walsh said to himself, feeling hollowed out, utterly empty within. Clarissa refused me, he thought. He stood there thinking, Clarissa refused me. "Ah," said St. Margaret's, like a hostess who comes into her drawing room on the very stroke of the hour and finds her guests there already. "I am not late. No, it is precisely 11:30, she says. Yet, though she is perfectly right, her voice, being the voice of the hostess, is reluctant to inflict its individuality. Some grief for the past holds it back, some concern for the present. "It is 11:30, she says, and the sound of St. Margaret's glides into the recesses of the heart and buries itself in ring after ring of sound, like something alive which wants to confide itself, to disperse itself, to be, with a tremor of delight, at rest. Like Clarissa herself, thought Peter Walsh, coming downstairs on the stroke of the hour in white. It is Clarissa herself, he thought, with a deep emotion, an extraordinarily clear yet puzzling recollection of her, as if this bell had come into the room years ago, where they sat at some moment of great intimacy, and had gone from one to the other and had left, like a bee with honey, laden with the moment. But what room, what moment, and why had he been so profoundly happy when the clock was striking? Then, as the sound of St. Margaret's languished, he thought, she has been ill, and the sound expressed languor and suffering. It was her heart, he remembered, and the sudden loudness of the final stroke told for death, that surprised in the midst of life. Clarissa falling where she stood, in her drawing room. "No, no," he cried, "she is not dead. I am not old," he cried, and marched up Whitehall, as if there rolled down to him, vigorous, unending, his future.